Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this webinar today, talking about global domestic mobility and the Weichert research and survey that we have been doing for the past 8 years. I'm so happy to welcome Helen Pereira from our Singapore office. Hi, Helen. So great to have you here to help us provide context to the survey data, because one thing that we all know is that a survey tells you only part of the story, but the real experience of managing our clients and their policies and how they really perform in real time is where we get a great combination that supports our survey. So thank you again. Today, we will be covering quite a lot of information. We're going to start with some highlights from the survey. Then we'll have a discussion around why domestic mobility matters so much. What are the key reasons why people are moving folks globally? And then we'll share some observations directly from the survey. We'll have Helen providing some context and her point of view. And then we'll talk about some key takeaways and some possible solutions, and also why there is so much reluctance. And there is a spoiler alert, that reluctance does not only come from the people who are moving. So we'll talk more about that as we move through. And I just want to start, as I said, with a little overview. So this survey and this research started 8 years ago. And 8 years ago, we had some context, which was we started to see definite increase in activity in global domestic mobility, especially in some key countries in APAC. And that's one of the reasons why we've asked Helen to participate. So since we started 8 years ago, we have seen 77 corporate responses in the running of the survey in 2023. And this survey factors in over 150 policies coming from 41% of the survey respondents. So 41% of those 77 are representing Fortune 500 companies. There are 60 or more, actually more than 60 companies represented by the survey. And there are 10 industries represented. So this is a really quite comprehensive survey, in our opinion. And so it just goes to show that since 2015, these 8 years, the amount of activity around global domestic has really become significant. And that's really what we want to dive into today. So moving on, I guess, to my first question for Helen is, clearly this is a thing. And we see many drivers of domestic growth. But I'd love to know from you, Helen, what are those key drivers? Why is global domestic mobility so important, especially in Asia Pacific?
Yeah, Laura, during COVID, many organizations, they ramped up their focus on their recruitment efforts, domestically. We had those travel restrictions, we had travel bans, but, they were in search of their best and brightest talent, from within. And they knew that there was this talent pool, and this was now the opportunity for them to leverage on that. Another thing that we also saw was that there was always cost and complexities around, international moves. And I think during COVID, there was this need to be very conservative. So I guess what they really looked at was, how do we look at the talent pool that we have, within country, within region, and how do we leverage on that and give these individuals an opportunity, to um, really go on assignment and leverage whatever talent that they had. So I think that this was one of the things, we're seeing a lot of robust economic growth in the Asia Pacific region. Just between India and China, they're projected to account for 2/3 of global growth in 2023. So I want to say that, this was a lot of stemming from COVID, and then I'm also looking at the current arena in terms of where mobility is going.
I absolutely agree with you. And some of the other things that we saw are, there's still this ongoing desire globally for people to continue to work in a hybrid and or remote option, but they're doing it even as they take a relocation. So like if we talked about, Beijing to Shanghai, people are going to move to Shanghai, but they may still be in a situation where they're working in a hybrid model or in a remote, partially remote model. Whereas in the past, they would not have done that staying in their place of origin. They would have moved and they would have been in the office all the time, or that the assignment just
Yeah.
simply wouldn't exist. Right.
Yes.
Another
Yeah.
area we saw was this real emphasis, especially in APAC, for new hires and early career talent to have the opportunity to broaden their experience. So companies are seeing that opportunity and moving people domestically for that purpose.
Yes,
Um,
I completely agree. And we've seen a lot of companies also doing virtual onboarding because you just talked about hybrid and remote world. I think one of the things that COVID has taught us is that uh, we can sustain. There was business continuity. We all had an opportunity to now think out of the box and leverage on technology. So we're definitely seeing that. We're seeing domestic assignments where they're not physically onboarding at the host location, but yes, they are working at home location. So I completely agree with you on that.
so we provide some context. We talk about the key drivers. One of the first observations that I made from the data, which I thought was pretty interesting, is that there's a definite emphasis now on longer term solutions. So permanent transfers have always been, from 2015 to the present, have always been the primary type of move in a global domestic scenario. But what was really interesting is that now we also see new hires. So we were just talking about new hires, right? They increased from 56% of respondents saying they had new hire moves to now 80%. So that's a
Mhm.
huge jump. So I thought that was worth mentioning. In terms of what you're seeing and volume in the countries that you have global domestic activity. Could you say that there's any one particular country that's having the most volume? And would that volume include this new hire segment?
Yeah, I mean, I'm so glad that you've actually brought that up because that's the bulk of our moves that we actually handled last year, and it's actually been very consistent since 2021 through 2022 and also into 2023, though we've seen some lower numbers. New college graduates, interns, specifically in India and Japan. So this is very interesting. It's a very huge population for us. I mean, year on year, we're looking at anywhere between 600 and 800 move just specifically for this population. You
Wow.
know, it, yeah,
Wow. And even though, so I'll just make one other point, which is that our survey included those 77 respondents were not only Weichert clients,
yeah,
but of course, Helen's experience is reflective of our clients. So you may be listening and saying, wow, that's interesting. Why those two countries? Obviously, that takes into account our client base. But
yeah.
even when you look at the results of a survey, Japan, India are still in the top. And then you would have to look at Malaysia, India, and several other countries, Australia being one of them as well, especially in the more recent year or two.
Yes.
So that's really great.
Yeah.
Another observation, which I thought was really interesting, as companies are increasing their domestic mobility, they're also shifting responsibility of administration to in country. So one of the biggest increases. From 2015, it was only 41% of companies administering their programs from in country. Now that number is 73%. That's a huge majority. So I'd love to know, Helen, from you, what is the impact of in-country administration on the way the programs are going from your point of view?
Well, Laura, I'm glad you actually asked that question. And I just wanted to go back to your earlier point. Yes, I talked a bit about our client base, but also we were we actually held a roundtable in September. It was for the FEM APEC Summit, and it was very interesting. We were talking about taking it up a notch, global domestic mobility, and it was very interesting to have the participants. We had HR representatives sitting at our table, and all of them actually saw a need to actually globalize the program because they had all been managed locally. So some of the challenges that they were having is that, maybe when it's managed at a local level, maybe they don't have that exposure. They're looking all about cost. They're not just thinking about maybe duty of care. It also talks about the whole employee experience. So I thought it was very interesting that these pool of HR specialists, attended our roundtable session because they actually wanted to look at how do we now look for a global domestic policy and take it away from being managed in-house. So
Mhm.
that was actually very interesting because they were trying to mirror an international policy and to make sure that they can actually align it where nothing was too skewed or too skinny.
Mhm.
So it was actually very interesting. And yes, what we've also seen, as much as we have these domestic programs that are managed locally, we're also now seeing that in order to achieve that, the full picture, the whole employee experience, and not just throw money and not without actually taking in the whole factor. We've actually seen global mobility now actually stepping in and
Interesting.
sort of, yeah, yeah,
Interesting.
so
Yeah.
yeah.
So there's a little bit of a slight nuance of difference there, right? So
Yes, yes,
we see, you in your experience, folks are trying to centralize again. Well, I think that it's like a pendulum that swings, right? There's some pros and cons for
yes,
sure to centralized versus localized. And what we've seen too is when you localize the administration, the lens almost becomes too narrow, right? And
yes,
if you allow a particular country to do everything, they may not see the bigger picture, the benefits
yeah,
of outsourcing, using a preferred provider, duty of care, things like this. So definitely, there are some advantages to having that local focus because. If I'm sitting here in the United States trying to make decisions for India, I'm not aware necessarily that different languages are spoken throughout the country and people may need different support moving
yeah,
within India. Right. So
yeah,
um, the next observation I think is kind of interesting too. It definitely, I think, sort of supports this same uh like where do we land? Do we go to this
yeah,
extreme of global or do we go to this extreme of regional guidance? What we're seeing is a more refined handling of this domestic activity. So now in 2023, more than 50% have policies covering different countries. So policies for
mhm,
China, policies for India, which I mean, in 2015, you had one policy, if any.
yes,
And we still, though, today see 25%. So one-fourth are still managing case by case, which is kind of like the opposite extreme of having guidelines. And
mhm,
then in the middle, you have 25% or roughly a quarter of those 77 respondents saying that they have just one policy that governs all countries. And that sounds a little scary. That's kind of where you have that. It's kind of like having that global administration for a very local situation. However, the caveat there was we did get some written comments where folks did say that although they have one policy for all, that they are moving to create country-specific, regional-specific policies or addendum to deal with those challenges of varying norms and needs of specific countries. So I think that question, or I should say this question, further refines what we're seeing in that global versus regional versus local administration.
Yeah.
Anything you want to share about that? Any comments
Yes,
there?
yeah, I want to say that I think a lot of companies may have had a so-called they had a domestic policy, but maybe it wasn't very it was underutilized. And now that we're seeing this growth in global domestic mobility, which is, in all fairness, just from what I've seen, is sort of overtaking the long-term assignments, which was, we all knew it to be, when you're going on assignment, it's a long-term assignment. So I think what I'm also seeing are companies that have a domestic policy now having to refine it to
Mm,
what makes sense, what would entice. So yes, they're all sort of elevating these policies, they're reviewing it, and they're asking, is this enough? And yeah, they're also doing it with maybe input from global mobility, because maybe they have a bigger vision in terms of, at the end of the day, like you said, duty of care. What does it mean to the employee that's starting with a company, their first job, or maybe that's going on an assignment? So I think what we're seeing is a collaboration. I'm actually seeing that right now for an existing client that we work with. Never was, local or teams having that interaction with global mobility, and it's actually very nice to see that collaboration.
well, the survey data totally validates what you're saying,
Yeah,
because
yeah.
another key observation is that the policies in 2015, where they existed, so again, a lot of the activity back then was case by case. So it was challenging to run surveying to really glean much from it because it was just so case by case. Back then, only two benefits were in the
Mm,
policy. Okay, like roughly 90% of the time, it was temporary living and household goods, or
yes.
temporary living in a lump sum, or household goods in a lump sum, or if you were really lucky, maybe all three. But
Mm-hmm.
today, the survey today shows seven common, I use the word core benefits. I don't mean core flex necessarily, but I mean seven consistent benefits throughout over 90% of the policies of those 77 companies that responded. So that's quite a change from two to
Mm-hmm.
seven. That's a real recognition that people want benefits in kind, and that companies, or not only that people want that, but companies are seeing the value in a more structured program. So very interesting. I think we can move on a little bit now to what the challenges are. And I think this is pretty interesting as well. I think I'm going to predict that you're going to tell me something different from what we see in the survey. But in 2015, more than half said the top challenge was the cost of transfers, and an equal number, so 52%, the cost of transfers, and an equal number, 52%, also said that consistency from country to country were their top challenges. And then the third was incompatibility of schooling. But it was a big drop, like it was less than half, it was only 35%. So that's not a strong showing of if you wanted to say a top three, it's really like a top two. So that was
Mm-hmm.
2015. In 2023, The top at 54% flipped to that consistency of benefits from, from country to country. And
Mhm.
cost didn't even make it to the top three. Okay. The second was spouse and partner reluctance at 40. And then the next was a big drop down. Only 31% talked about that variability, and they were more focused on the compensation part of the variability. So it now today, 2023, cost doesn't even make it to the top three challenges. What about in Asia? What about
Uh,
in Asia?
oh no, well that I must say, Laura, in just every summit, every roundtable session, and we're speaking with HR leaders in the APAC region, and the first thing they talk about is cost containment. How do we get the best employee experience but with the lowest costs possible? And I think I've seen a lot of that, specifically, when we talk about India. You want that whole employee experience, and yet there is that reluctance, or there is the we don't have the budget, or we need to scale it down, maybe source, you know, local providers that maybe can't deliver on a scale that a global provider can. So, yeah, that's very interesting that costs sort of dropped, but I'm not surprised to see about spousal support.
Mhm,
That's been um, an area of contention. We have come across some assignees who've basically said, well, my spouse is relocating with me, and what about providing this benefit? But really, it's up to the organization, and then it's a weighing factor of, okay, do we provide spousal support, or do we provide language training?
mhm. Yeah,
Because we need you to be
right.
able to onboard, acclimatize, maybe, from a business perspective. So those are just some of the, trends or challenges that we've seen.
Sure. And that, some of you may be saying, what language instruction? Why do you need language instruction for global domestic? And that was, I always wondered about that too, and assumed, no, it's no big deal. Like, and we're talking about India, of course, as the
Yep.
main. There's a little of that for Switzerland, but I mean, the Swiss, it just tends to not be, we don't hear about it with Switzerland, even though there are three official languages. um, we really are hearing about it for India, where there are cases where people are saying that they need to know that local, the local language, moving
Yep.
especially, from the extreme north to the extreme south. But
Yep.
let's hold that for a moment. Let's hold that
Sure.
thought, because I want to get more into the reluctance piece. I mentioned earlier the spoiler alert. So
Yes.
the
Yes.
so I think what we're finding out, which I thought was really interesting and also validated by a recent roundtable I held here in the New York, New Jersey area, and that was that the reluctance is not just about the family being reluctant, but it's about the companies being reluctant to spend. So I think that explains why in APAC, I mean, that's just my hypothesis and my opinion, that there's still so much, you know, emphasis on cost, because companies are still so hyper focused on cost. The fact is that there's still such a huge pipeline of talent in India, that if this candidate doesn't want to take the move because there's not enough support, there's five more candidates in line, maybe 10, maybe
Yes.
20. So, there's still that situation happening in India, in China, and in some other countries in APAC. And that's why companies can still sort of hang their hat on trying to minimize spend as much as possible. Whereas in other countries, that may really not be the case anymore, where that the balance of reluctance
Mm.
tips towards employees, and companies have had to adjust more towards, supporting the employee than worrying about spend. So
Yeah, but
talking
Laura,
about, sorry, go ahead.
oh, sorry. I didn't mean to cut you. I was just going to say that I actually see that in Japan as well.
Mm,
And it's for new college graduates, which is, provide the bare minimum, maybe 2 days hotel stay and that's it. And the feedback when we being an RMC and we talk about, okay, well, have you considered this? You're onboarding a new college graduate is their first experience in the real world. Have you considered this? And some of the feedback we receive is, oh, they're just a new college graduate. There's no budget for them.
right.
Let's
Well,
just give them the, yeah, or it's not there's no importance there. Let me just put it in that way. And so I agree with you in terms of what you said, that yes, it does boil down to costs.
and you know what? That's a perfect segue to talking about the two main factors in reluctance from the employee point of view.
Hmm.
And it impacts the first one, I think, impacts those new hires the most, and that's the cost of living, the lack of cost of living assistance is one of the biggest. So the number one and number two kind of neck and neck.
Hmm.
Um, and that situation is significant because the survey findings show that nowadays only 7% of the companies with India Global Domestic are doing anything about a cost of living assistance. So that would be the lowest, but there are countries that are doing zero. So that's better than
Hmm.
zero, right? 7% in India. And on the opposite end, the one country that's providing the most is Mexico. 25% of companies report that they're providing some type of cost of living. China, Japan, Brazil are also in the mix, but all the rest of the countries. So I think I told you 60 countries represented. Only five out of the 60 are at least within the policy, right? Formally providing cost of living assistance. We always have to take that into account because there are always case by case situations that we can't account for that are not documented. So with that cost of living assistance, to me, that's number one opportunity, number one disconnect, and therefore number one opportunity to make a change to overcome that reluctance for folks to take the move. And like I said, I think it would probably affect a new hire the most because their salary is going to be the lowest.
Yes.
The second one, and then I'm going to ask you to weigh in. I mean, you kind of already weighed in on that first one, but the second one is really significant. I don't know that they're one more than the other, but this, you mentioned it, is this family assistance. And what the survey showed us this time, in 2021, 24% of the respondents included family assistance in at least one of their policies. It doesn't mean it was included for everyone, but at least in some or one of their policies. Today, that number actually dropped. Only 12% include family assistance. Now, statistics are funny, right? We always have to take into account we did have an increased number of respondents, so that could impact the percentage. And also, the respondents are not necessarily all the same companies, right? We have more, so
Yeah.
there's more in the mix. But even so, these numbers, 12, 24%, are really low when you consider
Hmm.
how many respondents say that their number one and number two reluctance is around assistance.
Hmm.
Right? So whether we're talking about school, school finding or career or just other family support, this is really, to me, a huge opportunity. And I'm just now really curious to hear what you have to say, Helen, about this.
No, I agree with you, Laura. I think that one thing we just need to recognize is that in the Asian culture, extended families there's that whole concept of extended family. So not only are you with your spouse and your, your children, but you've also got your family. You may have your in-laws. So that whole extended family support, I think that plays a very big factor. What I have seen is, one of our clients actually supports up to 5 family members that will relocate permanently with the employee, and they would actually support them for the period of temp living. And so you don't see that very often. You don't get to see those kind of benefits. But I think that what this company did was to take into consideration about the whole extended family living culture and concept.
Right.
So I thought that was a plus. But yeah, we, like I said, we don't see a lot of companies doing that and taking that consideration, and that could fall into the uh the numbers that you just shared in terms of no family support. That could fall into that category. And it
Yeah.
makes it does. We've had some assignees who have said that, no, if my family can't relocate with me, then I'm not taking the assignment. Yeah, I'm not moving.
Right.
So yeah, we've seen that.
Well, it's really not surprising. And, if I were had a crystal ball, which of course I don't, I would predict perhaps as time goes on and global domestic mobility continues to increase in Asia Pacific, in Europe, even in North America. I'm going to
Yeah.
exclude US and Canada as we always do, because when we talk about global domestic, because we have these home sale programs which have been in existence for decades. So it just changes the nature of the way programs exist in these countries. But if I were to predict, I would say, I think as time goes on, and this survey is showing the
Hmm.
programs are becoming more refined, more specific in terms of the benefits. And I do think eventually the pressure from reluctance is going to cause a situation where more and more companies will provide these type of benefits. I hope so.
Yeah.
um, so, just to wrap up, let's talk at a high level again about what our key takeaways are from both the observations and what we see as challenges and reluctance. So number one, the last thing we just discussed, companies are simply not providing adequate family assistance. Number two, reluctance to relocate, whether we're talking about from the employee or the company's reluctance to support relocation, is definitely a growing challenge as the volume increases. Number three, equity in mobility programs means that one size is never going to fit all. And that really has to do with that conversation we had earlier about, do we administer or design policies locally or globally? Do we need a policy per country? Can we do it with addendums? Can we address the situation with addendums? So I think we can fairly say there's always going to be country-specific norms that are going to mandate that we support certain things in one place versus differently from another. The
Hmm.
fourth, low to high cost moves require support, but still this type of support is so limited. Companies really need to figure out a way to provide some kind of cost of living assistance. And then the last, but maybe one of the most challenging, is how we balance flexibility and consistency. That's always a problem, but it seems to
Hmm.
be a real struggle, especially with global domestic. And offline, when Helen and I were discussing this session, literally we could not come up with one company that has fully successfully come up with we call it the mousetrap for how to do this. Right, Helen? I mean, there are definitely programs out there are moving in the right direction, but it's still a work in progress. Is that fair to say?
Yes, I completely agree with you, Laura, and I think it'll be very interesting to see how global mobility programs are going to evolve, how domestic policies are going to evolve. I think, yeah, we just have to stay tuned maybe for the next webinar in, I don't know, maybe next year or the year after, and then we
There
can
you
talk about
go.
how it's evolved. Yeah.
Well, that's a great place for us to take a pause. In our next segment, I will be demonstrating our country-specific research in a deeper dive. Taking a moment now just to quickly review how our country-specific reports work. Above, you'll see the link, and it brings you right to this page that shows you we have 12 reports in all. We just added 5 countries this year, and previously we had these 7. So for today, I'll just quickly demonstrate our Japan report so that you can see what information is available. All 12 countries are set up the very same way with country-specific benefits, rental practices, corporate housing, education, and transportation. So if you click on any of these links, you'll get information that shows, first of all, what the top benefits provided are in that particular country. So for Japan, you'll see right here, pre-trip and relocation travel, upfront property costs, and household goods. And then on the right, some specific recommendations that pertain to global domestic movement in Japan specifically. On the next link, under rental practices, you see that there is key money and deposits, 2 to 3 times monthly rent. So that would be important for anyone to know who's administering Japan domestic activity. Next, we have corporate housing, and if you hover over any one of these, you'll see the different types of housing available. In the next section, education, it works similarly, hovering over the different types of schools that are available. And then in the last section, we have the transportation options. And again, each country is set up the same way. And of course, the transportation options for each country will look different. So there you have it. This is one example of our country-specific reports. And now we'll turn to the Q&A section of our presentation.